everyone, Clio here, and today we are going to do a mid-month wrap-up. So I did this last month as well, and then I ended up not reading a whole lot in the second part of the month, so I'm hoping that that will change this month. But as I already read 6 books at this point in the month, I decided, you know what, let me just do a mid-month wrap-up again. So I'm actually only going to be talking about 5 of these, because one of these I read for the BookTube prize, and like part of the sort of like rules around it is that you don't talk about your experiences with this book before before voting has closed. I have actually accidentally broken that rule by talking about it in a reading vlog, so you can find my ideas about it back if you absolutely want to, but like I'm going to keep it until the end of the month. So normally when I only do one wrap-up, I do the haul section to it as well, but with the mid-month wrap-ups, I leave my haul section for the end of month wrap-up. So the majority of the reads that I actually did so far in this month have not been physical reads. They've been audiobook, there's been ebooks, and a part of these books have been for a book club. So I'm going to talk about those two first. So the first book that I'm going to talk about is the Gospel of Loki by Joanne M. Harris. This is the book that I was going to read in August for the Of Queens, Witches and Valkyries book club, and so I caught up to that one just yesterday actually. And so the Gospel of Loki is a Loki retelling, so a Norse mythology retelling, and it's definitely a book in which we are following a anti-hero, because Loki is very much the sort of like trickster god, very much the outcast within Asgardian society, and so that's definitely one of the themes that runs through this. So Loki is very much a element of chaos, so if the worlds exist out of order and chaos, so then the gods are order and then Loki's part of the chaos, but he is tricked or lured in by Odin to leave the realm of chaos and to join the gods in Asgard. But throughout the book we will be looking at how Loki definitely feels like an outcast and definitely is treated like one for a big part of the novel. And yes, he does definitely do some rather dodgy business that keeps him in that status, and definitely as the novel progresses, the sort of decisions that he makes become more and more questionable, more and more morally grey or on the side of evil. But it's very fun to read from Loki's character because he is reading with a sort of hindsight perspective, so we often get these hints, of course, of how certain decisions that he makes in early parts of the novel will have an impact on the later novels, and there's definitely a whole lot of humor interlaced with this novel as well. As you can see, I highlighted quite a lot about this novel. A very fun book, very entertaining, and it was also very interesting to dive into this mythology that I actually personally haven't had too much experience with, apart from like the Marvel interpretation of it, which you can actually retrieve quite a lot from in this book, because obviously that is also inspired by Norse mythology. Definitely enjoyed this one and the sort of play on prophecy as well, because running theme throughout this book is the fact that there's this prophecy that is being told and the way in which the players within the game will be responding to this prophecy. And this sort of like play on is this sort of traditional play on whether prophecy is a sort of like self-fulfilling entity, where once you've heard a prophecy, the prophecy will definitely come true. This is definitely something that this book plays on. So absolutely enjoyed this one. It's a quick read, it's an entertaining read, but there's also some meat to the story as well, and I definitely want to read the sequel to this one as well now. Second book that I read for that same book club is Gods of Jade and Shadow by Silvia Moreno-García. This is a Mayan-inspired mythology retelling, and in this one we are following our protagonist called Cassiopeia. So this is a young girl living in her grandfather's house and more or less living in servitude to her grandfather. She needs to do all the cleaning up, the ironing, taking care of him, cooking and all of those things, and in exchange she's expecting to inherit some money from him at some point. However, her cousin, who's always been kind of vile to her, implies that she is not getting anything from her godfather, that there's nothing written down in his will. So in a moment of anger she opens one of her grandfather's prized possession, a box that he never allows anybody to look into, and in the box are a lot of bones that end up resurrecting the god of death. So she goes on a quest with the god of death to try and recover his body parts, his lost body parts, and then thus being able to reclaim his full power and having him be able to reclaim his throne, because his twin brother has actually betrayed him and stolen his throne. The book is very much about the way in which words and language shape our world. These gods are very much dependent upon having people worship them, and on the stories that people tell, as the way in which these gods are represented or the way in which their dwellings are talked about very much shape the reality of their existence. And so I very much love that thematic. I love talking about the impact that language has on our world, or at least on the way that we see our world. So I definitely loved a whole lot of quotes that were coming into the story because of this. Apart from this, there are definitely a lot more of interesting elements to this story. I very much loved the world building in this story, not just that element of stories forming a part of the way in which the world is represented, but also just the way in which we are looking at Mexico itself. I very much really wanted, I really felt myself transported to that place, to that culture, to that atmosphere. I very much wanted to eat all the Mexican food I can get my hands on while I was reading it. And I definitely also very much loved that whole dark atmosphere that was given to the underworld, to Xibalba. So it's very much a dark passage when we get to that part of the novel. And I was loving every moment of it. Apart from that, I absolutely love the romance that is in here. It did surprising things with romance. There's this sort of stereotypical story that you expect it to go into from the get-go, and it does definitely develop with Cassiopeia and the god character of Huncame getting a romantic engagement. However, there's very much a slow burn to the development of this relationship, and it definitely feels realistic. It doesn't feel like the author is playing with our emotions, trying to drag the story along, trying to invent obstacles that aren't there. So Huncame is a god who doesn't have emotions, but the longer that he is out into the human world, the longer that he is staying out in the world without having all of his body parts retrieved, the more human he himself becomes. And so the further that we get into the novel, the more that he can start to develop and showcase these human emotions. Very much enjoyed that one, would definitely recommend it. Definitely want to dive into Mayan mythology. I actually read the book that this is based on. So this is actually based on the Popol Vuh, which is basically the only book I think of Mayan mythology that has been passed down. I read this in Spanish when I was studying Spanish. I don't remember too much about it, or actually about enjoying this book. So I might want to revisit the Popol Vuh at some points. Diving into another read. What am I going to talk about now? Let me talk about The New Wilderness by Diane Cook. So I have a full Booker Book talk about this book, so I will link that down below, possibly also up in the thingy here. So The New Wilderness is a Booker long-listed book, and the Booker long shortlist was just announced, and it also made the shortlist. However, I did not enjoy this read. So in The New Wilderness we are following mainly two characters. We are following Bee and her daughter Agnes, who have to escape the city because this book is set in the future, and in this future cities have become heavily polluted, and so the air becomes kind of a hazard to a lot of vulnerable groups, such as young children. But however, there's not much of an alternative, because the wilderness is an uninhabitable place. It is basically a place where nobody is allowed to go. However, there's a sort of pioneer project that's being set up, and so Bee and her daughters form part of that pioneering group that will be the first group that will go out into the wilderness and will try to survive without leaving any sort of a trace. Throughout this experience, however, Bee will see that her daughter is becoming more and more wild, that she is very much being formed by living in this wilderness environment and becoming very different from the person that she was expecting her daughter to be. Did not enjoy this one. I was expecting it to be a whole lot more darker, a whole lot more action-packed, and I was expecting there to be a lot more focus on the fact that we are trying to survive in nature, whereas I feel that there was a lot more focus on human aspect of this story, on the human relationships within the group, but definitely a whole lot of focus on the mother-daughter relationship. And it was a very complex mother-daughter relationship, but it just never really worked for me. I'm pretty sure that's probably quite realistic representation of a certain mother-daughter relationship. For me, there was just a little bit too much of that push-pull towards one another, and apart from that, there just wasn't enough action that could compensate for that sort of weird relationship that I wasn't fully sure of how it was developing or why it was developing in that certain way. So all in all, it just wasn't a very enjoyable experience for me to read this book. Next up, let me talk about a short story or a novella that I read, and that is The Dragon of Innis by Minerva Cerridwen. So this is a novella that should be out now, but it actually was published before this already. So the publisher is out of print, and so this book had to go find a new publisher. And when looking for a new publisher, they also took the opportunity to rewrite this story. So this is a story about a dragon who's living close to a village, but they are living in relative peace and harmony. The dragon does have a tendency to go about and steal stuff from the village, but that just means that one of the knights from the city, from this village, kind of has to go over to the dragon and try and retrieve those items every once in a while. However, one day it is not an item that has gone missing, but one of its inhabitants. The story is very much about LGBTQ representation. We have trans representation, we have asexual representation. And while I definitely like the story and like the fact that the author reworked this book based on some criticism she had gotten about this representation in specific, I do definitely think that there's not a whole lot of meat to this story. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it to people. I do definitely think that it is a very nice story, and I actually think it's quite a good story for younger people to consume. For young children, for example, it definitely has that sort of fairy tale vibe to it, and so it definitely would work very well as a sort of like nighttime story. And one of the things that I absolutely loved that it was doing was it's using these sort of names of flowers to give to its characters, and as a result you're creating this sort of world in which there isn't a possibility to know someone's gender based on somebody's name. You know, a name can be male, female, you have no idea, so you have to actively ask for everybody's pronouns. So I thought that was a very clever way of normalizing asking for people's pronouns within this story. So yeah, did enjoy this one, though it's not going to stay high on my radar. It's probably one of those stories that I'll forget about very quickly. Next, let me talk about You Should See Me in a Crown by Leah Johnson. Basically, when I looked at my list of when I looked at my pile of possibilities at the beginning of the month, I thought that this was most likely going to be one of the books that I wouldn't get around to because it didn't necessarily have a high priority for me. However, I am in a group chat with a couple of people with disabilities, and they were saying that I really liked the disability rep within this story. And so I hadn't heard anybody talk about the disability rep within this story, and it's definitely not a high point of like plot development or character focus, but still it's very nicely done, and it is definitely there, part of this story. So in You Should See Me in a Crown, we are following our protagonist called Liz. Now she has this very specific vision of her future in front of her. She is going to go to a specific university, she's going to study to become a doctor, and she will be part of the orchestra of this university. However, she does not make it into the orchestra, and therefore she also does not get enough financial aid. But she comes up with an alternative plan because she is living in this town that's kind of obsessed with prom, and so if she becomes prom queen, she will win a scholarship. But throughout this process, she falls in love with the competition because there's a new girl in school who's running for prom queen, and they kind of hit it off. So things that I loved about this book, first of all, the romance. I definitely think the romance worked very well. And while there is a little bit of that insta-love element to the romance, I definitely do feel like it's developed well enough and given enough of meat to the relationship for you to root for it without it feeling like a little bit too cliche. And also, while this romance is a major part of this book, there are so many elements put into this book and balanced correctly so that it definitely doesn't feel like there's only romance in this book, or like the romance is the entire point to this novel. I think for the entirety of this story it really felt very real. A lot of times with these sort of like romance plot lines you can feel like that's something that only happens in a romance novel, but it definitely felt so well developed, so well balanced, that at no point in this novel did I really get that feeling, except for maybe some sort of like food fight scenes and stuff like that. And then to get to the disability representation, so Liz's brother and her mother, and I think also her grandparents, have sickle cell disease, and so while it's not a major part of the storyline, it does motivate her to become a doctor, for example. And I definitely loved how it would just played a natural part within this story and was just an additional layering to the reality of this person's world. What I also very much thought was very well done about the disability rep is that her brother is a little bit careless with his medication when he's doing well, which I definitely think is something that people with with any sort of chronic illness or chronic ailments can relate to. And it's definitely a sort of a roller coaster that I go on with my physical pain for my shoulder as well, where when I'm in severe pain, I will definitely be looking up all sorts of ways in which to reduce pain, all sorts of ways into which to get better in that sense. But when I'm not feeling a lot of pain, I won't really keep up with those, thus resulting in me getting more pain again in other periods of time. So I definitely could relate to that experience a whole lot. And so I won't go into too much with the plot line that has to do with the disability rep, but I just really loved how it was part of that story without like this being a story about the tragedy of having somebody in your family with sickle cell disease. Another great form of representation that is in there that I won't go into too much, for example, is anxiety representation. So I also liked that addition to it. So I very much love that this story builds on so many elements without it ever feeling like the author was taking on too much, was trying to put in too much into the story, or without it feeling like one of these elements was overpowering the others. I definitely think it was a huge balancing project, but that she balanced it perfectly. But so yeah, that is it in terms of the books that I read this month that I'm already going to talk to you guys about, and then I'll see you at the end of the month to talk about the rest of my reads. So yeah, see you guys for the next one. Bye!